All righty, we are on Deuteronomy chapter 26. We're moving right along. I guess we need to be thinking about 26. We've got like what, 8 more chapters to go. So do we want to move on to Joshua next?
I would like that.
I can start creating a graphic for that. Okay. My 26 is all one solid thing.
Yeah.
Who would like to read?
Mine has a break.
Oh, where's your break at? It's not very long though. It's only 19.
Yeah, it's 16. I mean, it's only to 19. You're right.
Yeah, why don't we just go ahead and read the whole thing?
I'll read.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Kim.
All right. Prayers to God. When you arrive in the land and have conquered it and are living there, you must present to the Lord at his sanctuary the first sample from each annual harvest. Bring it in a basket and hand it to the priest on duty and say to him, "This gift is my acknowledgement that the Lord my God has brought me to the land he promised our ancestors." The priest will then take the basket from your hand and set it before the altar. You shall then say before the Lord your God, "My ancestors were migrant Arameans who went to Egypt for refuge. They were few in number, but in Egypt they became a mighty nation. The Egyptians mistreated us, and we cried to the Lord God. He heard us and saw our hardship, toil, and oppression, and brought us out of Egypt with mighty miracles and a powerful hand. He did great and awesome miracles before the Egyptians and has brought us to this place and given us this land flowing with milk and honey. And now, O Lord, see, I have brought you a token of the first of the crops from the ground you have given me. Then place the samples before the Lord your God and worship him. Afterwards, go and feast on all the good things he has given you. Celebrate with your family and with any Levites or migrants living among you. Every third year is a year of special tithing. That year, you are to give all your tithes to the Levites, migrants, orphans, and widows, so that they will be well fed. Then you shall declare before the Lord your God, "I have given all my tithes to the Levites, the migrants, the orphans, and the widows, just as you commanded me. I have not violated or forgotten any of your rules. I have not touched the tithe while I was ceremonial defiled, for instance, when I was in mourning, nor have I offered any of it to the dead. I have obeyed the Lord my God and have done everything you commanded me. Look down from your holy home in heaven and bless your people and the land you have given us, as you promised our ancestors. Make it a land flowing with milk and honey." Keeping God's laws. You must wholeheartedly obey all of these commandments and ordinances which the Lord your God is giving you today. You have declared today that he is your God, and you have promised to obey and keep his laws and ordinances and to heed all he tells you to do. And the Lord has declared today that you are his very own people, just as he promised, and that you must obey all of his laws. If you do, he will make you greater than any other nation, allowing you to receive praise, honor, and renown. But to attain this honor and renown, you must be a holy people to the Lord your God, as he requires.
Oh, I like that yours says requires. Mine says promised.
As he requires. Because it says to attain this honor and renown, you must be a holy people to the Lord your God, as he requires.
Yeah, see, mine keeps saying as he has promised you. I think it's going to be interesting because I think it should be requires. Like, Because this mine interprets it almost like, well, he promised to give you this, but there's no weight on your side. Oh, here it says you are to keep all his commandments. Interesting here too. One of the things Crazy Man has pointed out in Revelation where it says glory and honor and power. And he said every time there's like an and between things, it means it's like very specific, like not to group them together, but so like the seven spirits are that glory and honor. And I in my version here, it's doing that. It says, as he has promised you, and that you keep all his commandments, and that he set you in praise and in fame and in high honor, and that you shall be a people holy.
What verse did you start with there?
Um,
Let me write that.
I'm at like around 18. As he promised you, and you are to keep all his commandments. 19, and he will set you in praise and in fame and in high honor, and that you shall be a people holy. Whenever you're ready, Cindy.
Okay, there's a little blurb on the key word. And the key word is land. The common Old Testament word land possesses several shades of meaning. In essence, all land belongs to God as its creator. Psalm 24:1. When God promised the Israelites the land of Canaan, it was his to give. The land of Canaan was so representative of God's covenant with the Israelites that it became one of their identifying characteristics. They were known as the people of the land. Okay, an overview 26:1-15. As the stipulation section of Deuteronomy came to an end, Moses commanded the people to keep two rituals when they had conquered the land and began to enjoy its produce. These two rituals were the initial first fruits offering and the third year special tithe. In both cases, there is an emphasis upon the prayer of confession to be given at the time of the rituals. These special offerings were given in order to celebrate Israel's transition from a nomadic existence to a settled agrarian community made possible by the Lord's blessing. 26:2, the first of all the produce. Baskets of the first fruits from the first harvest reaped by Israel, once they were in the land of Canaan, were to be taken to the tabernacle.
Your sound's cutting out, Cindy.
Again?
Well, you're okay. I think it's maybe where your voice is going. 'Cause right there, it's fine. Maybe because
Okay, how is it now?
yeah, it's fine. Maybe
Okay.
it's because you were talking sideways.
Yeah. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
This is to be distinguished from the annual Feast of First Fruits, celebrated in conjunction with the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. 26:5. The offerings of the first fruits was to be accompanied by an elaborate confession of the Lord's faithfulness in preserving Israel and bringing the people into the land. The essential aspects of the worshipers coming to the sanctuary were the presentation of the first fruits, bowing in worship, and rejoicing in the Lord's goodness. In this manner, the visit to the sanctuary was a confession and acknowledgement of God. It was a time of praise and rejoicing because of God's goodness and mercy extended to former generations and evidence of divine sustaining grace at that time. Assyrian about to perish. The word perish is better translated as wandering. A wandering Syrian referred to Jacob, who was each Israelite's father or ancestor. When Jacob fled from his home in Beersheba, he passed through Syria to Mesopotamia to live with Laban, his uncle. Returning from there, Jacob was overtaken by Laban after he came through Syria at the Jabbok River, where
I
he
don't
not
think
only
that
faced the wrath of
I don't think that I recognize that Laban lived in Egypt. Isn't that what that just said? That Jacob was the Armenian and that he went down to Egypt, and he said something about him going to Laban. Is that what he's saying?
to Mesopotamia to live with Laban, his uncle.
See, now so my verse 5, it says about this wonder, Armenian was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, a few in number, and then he became a great and mighty. See, I would have thought that was talking about Joseph.
That's what it sounded like in our Bible.
Reading. Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead. I mean, Jake.
Well, my commentary says, no, wandering can mean lost or dying. Also, Armenians were the people of northern Syria and among the ancestors of Abraham. This is also used as a reference to Jacob, who spent many years there and got his 2 wives in Aram, A-R-A-M. That's not in Egypt, is it?
Mesopotamia.
Aram.
Oh,
Aram, I see that too.
Let me look at Genesis. Oh, man, that's
I
the
was gonna say my
2031.
phone's out in the living room for me to Google it.
Genesis 24:10, I think is the reference.
Okay. Genesis 24:10. Then he loaded 10 of Abraham's camels with all kinds of expensive gifts from his master, and he traveled to the distant Aram, Naharaim. He went to the town of Abraham's brother Nahor and settled.
Well, and it mentions Jacob here later. It says Jacob was overtaken by Laban after he came through Syria at the Jabbok River, where he not only faced the wrath of Laban, but also that of Esau, his brother. Later, the famine in Canaan necessitated his migration to Egypt. When the
That was
Israelites,
after he got his wives, right?
yeah,
Okay. Sorry.
it's all right. When the Israelites became populous and powerful, they were oppressed by the Egyptians, but it was God who responded to their prayers and miraculously delivered them out of Egypt. It was God who enabled them to enter and conquer the land from which the first fruits were presented before the altar. 26:12, the tithe. The tithe collected every 3rd year of Israel's existence in the land of Canaan. Apparently, this tithe was not taken to the central sanctuary, but distributed locally to Levites, immigrants, widows, and orphans. 26:13-14. The confession to be made in connection with the offering of this first tithe consisted of a statement of obedience and a prayer for God's blessing. In this manner, the Israelites confessed their continual dependence on God and lived in obedient expectance of God's continued gracious blessing. 26:15. Look down from heaven. This was the first reference to God's dwelling place being in heaven. From his abode in heaven, God had given the Israelites the land flowing with milk and honey, as he had promised to the patriarchs. His continued blessing on both the people and the land was requested. 16-19. the affirmation of obedience. The last 4 verses of the chapter concluded Moses' explanation of the law's stipulations by calling for the total commitment by Israel to the Lord and his commands. These verses can be viewed as the formal ratification of the Sinaitic covenant between the Lord and the second generation of Israel. In accepting the terms of this agreement, acknowledging that the Lord is their God, and promising wholehearted obedience, plus a desire to listen to God's voice, the Israelites were assured that they were his people and the chosen over all other nations to receive his blessings and the calling to witness to his glory to all the world. That's it. Well, it does have 26:16 this day. That is the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year.
Well, I was looking, and Egypt is literally at the southern border, which I don't know that like literally the Gaza Strip ends and then it's Egypt. I don't know that I recognized it being so close to Israel. And how close we were when we were there, because we were at En Gedi in the Dead Sea, and we were at Beersheba, which is like the southernest point where people live.
In Genesis, my Bible has like a description of Jacob, and it says it's talking about stages in his life. But Jacob's last stage of life was to be grabbed. God achieved a firm hold on him in responding to Joseph's invitation to come to Egypt. Jacob was clearly unwilling to make a move without God's approval. So he did go to Egypt because Joseph invited him to come to Egypt.
Due to starvation.
Yeah, but early on, does someone have their phones handy or something handy to do a Google search? Where did Laban live when he went and got Leah and Rachel?
My concordance says Armin, but we'll see what everything else says.
Aram?
Yeah, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
that would,
I looked it up. Laban and his family were described as dwelling in Aram in Mesopotamia.
see, Mesopotamia, isn't that, I'm thinking Mediterranean. Where was
Yeah,
Mesopotamia?
isn't Mesopotamia like it's all part of that area? It's part of the Fertile Crescent or something like that.
I don't know. Mesopotamia, okay, is this like down by Assyria, which has Nineveh. So that would be above the Arab desert. Mesopotamia would be to the right of Canaan. So that would be like Iran, Iraq, right? Amman,
Yeah.
Amon, is on the other side of the Jordan. So that he was
Yeah.
not. Go ahead.
I looked at what it is today.
Yeah.
And yeah, that Mesopotamia, that is the Fertile Crescent. It is known as present day Iraq. In
So
the
I
broader
wonder-
sense, the historical region of Mesopotamia also includes parts of present day Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Kuwait.
So it's saying he went down to Egypt when Joseph was down there, then is what that meant. He was the father of nations. So when he went down into Egypt and sojourned there with Joseph, and then they became a great nation there. It should not have been that hard, but for some reason in my brain it was. Thank you, guys. Kathy, whenever you're ready.
Okay. A little bit of an overview here first. Obedient people. It isn't enough for a nation to have gifted and godly leaders. It must also have godly citizens who obey the law of the Lord. Confucius said the strength of a nation is derived from the integrity of its homes. But homes are made up of individuals, so it's the strength of the individual that helps to make the home what it ought to be. Whatever makes men good Christians, said Daniel Webster, makes them good citizens. The 3 public confessions recorded in this chapter help us understand what kind of citizens we ought to be as the followers of Jesus Christ. Confession of God's goodness, verses 1 to 11. This ceremony was to be used the first time any Jew brought his first fruits offering to the Lord. It should not be confused with the annual first fruits offering. And there are references to Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Not only was this special ceremony a confession of God's goodness to Israel and to this worshiper, but it was also a declaration that the man had now claimed his inheritance in the land. He had worked the land and received a harvest, and brought the first and the best to give to the Lord. The basket of fruit sitting by the altar was a witness to the faithfulness of the Lord to his people. The entire ceremony was an Old Testament version of Matthew 6:33. The confession begins with Israel's entrance into the land of Canaan, and this would remind the worshiper of the miracle of the crossing of the Jordan, reference to Joshua. The God who opened the Red Sea for the nation to get out of Egypt also opened the Jordan River so they could go in and claim their inheritance. He brought us out that he might bring us in.
Would you say Matthew 6:43?
33.
Oh, 33. Okay. Sorry.
The only reason the Jews didn't enter the land sooner was because the older generation rebelled against the Lord at Kadesh and refused to trust him for victory. Reference to Numbers. The worshiper was reminded that the secret of Israel's great success was faith in the promises of God. Years later, Joshua would say, "There failed nothing of any good thing which the Lord had spoken into the house of Israel. All came to pass." Reference to Joshua and to 1 Kings. Then the worshiper would speak about Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's verse 5. Who left home and went to Haran in northwest Mesopotamia. Reference to Hosea and Genesis. To find himself a wife. After 20 years in the household of his father-in-law Laban, Jacob obeyed God's commandment and returned to his own land and settled down with his 12 sons and their families. Indeed, Jacob had been a fugitive and a pilgrim all those years, but the Lord had watched over him and blessed him. Jacob's 12 sons were to become the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. Through Israel, God would bless the whole world. Reference to Genesis. How would God transform one man's family into a great nation? By taking them down to Egypt, where they were put through the iron furnace of suffering. References to Deuteronomy, 1 Kings, and Genesis. 70 people traveled to Egypt, where Joseph had prepared homes for them. And years later, on Passover night, probably 2 million Jews marched triumphantly out of Egypt. The more the enemy persecuted the Jews, the more the Jews had multiplied. Reference to Exodus. Suffering and trial were often God's tools for bringing blessing to his people, though at the time we may not understand it. The more the enemy persecuted the early church, the more they scattered and multiplied. Reference to Acts. The confession mentions nothing about Israel's complaining on their journey or their failure at Kadesh Barnea. This is a confession of faith, not unbelief. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt. He has brought us to this place and has given us this land. The man calls Canaan a land that flows with milk and honey, which is what God often called it. God gave his people a wonderful land that would meet their every need. During Israel's years of wandering and rebellion, some of the Jews called Egypt a land that flows with milk and honey. Reference to Numbers. It's tragic when people are so unspiritual that the things of the world are more inviting than the things of the Lord. In response to the goodness and grace of the Lord, the worshiper presented to God the first and best of his labors, for there would have been no harvest apart from the blessing of the Lord. But in presenting the first fruits, the worshiper was actually giving the entire harvest to the Lord. Stewardship doesn't mean that we give God a part and then use the rest as we please. True stewardship means that we give God what belongs to him as an acknowledgement that all that we have is his. We then use all that is left wisely for his glory. To bring the Lord 10% and then waste 90% that remains is not stewardship, it's foolishness. The Lord gives us richly all things to enjoy, reference to 1 Timothy, which explains why Moses admonished the Jews to rejoice in every good thing that the Lord gave them. While at the sanctuary, they could bring a thank offering to the Lord and enjoy a feast of good things, all to the glory of God. But note the mention of the Levite and the stranger, those with whom we need to share the gifts of the Lord. This introduces the second confession, the confession of honesty and generosity, verses 12 to 15. This scene would take place 2 years later when the Jews were supposed to bring the extra tithe to the local officers. The previous ceremony occurred only once after the first harvest in the land, but this ceremony was repeated every 3rd year. The 7th year would be the Sabbath year, and then the cycle started again. This confession was tantamount to summary renewal of the covenant that Israel made at Sinai, their promise to obey the Lord and his promise to bless their obedience. The tithe of the 3rd year was kept in the towns and used locally to feed the Levites, strangers, orphans, and widows. In giving this tithe, the worshiper was to confess to the Lord that he had been honest in setting aside the tithe and using it as the Lord commanded. He was not to take the tithe for his own personal use, and certainly not to use it for any sinful purpose. He had been careful not to defile the tithe by touching it while unclean because of a death in the family. In other words, the setting aside of this tithe for others was a serious matter and had to be done with dignity and obedience. The ceremony would end with the prayer of 26:15, asking God to bless the whole nation and not just the individual worshiper. Both the first and second confession express appreciation for the land flowing with milk and honey. It's a good thing when God's people appreciate all the Lord gives them. During their 40 years of wandering, the older generation had frequently wanted to go back to Egypt and enjoy the food they had eaten there. But this backward look only got them into trouble. When it comes to circumstances of life, we all need to follow Paul's example. I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Philippians 4:11. One of the best ways to learn contentment is to share with others the blessings God gives us. Confession of obedience, verses 16 to 19. The first two confessions looked forward to the time when Israel would be settled in their land and reaping the harvest. This confession brings us back to the plains of Moab, where Moses was equipping the younger generation to enter the land. This day, verses 16 to 18, and today were words Moses used frequently as he addressed the people. It was indeed a solemn time when Moses reiterated the law and reviewed the nation's history. The future of the nation depended on the people receiving, understanding, and obeying the word of God that Moses was sharing with them. The constant danger was that the people not receive God's word into their hearts, but only hear it with their ears and forget it. Like the Jewish people in Jesus' day, they had ears but could not hear. Reference to Matthew. A mere casual acquaintance with the word isn't sufficient. If God's word is to nurture us and change us so that God can bless us, reference to Psalms, we must devote ourselves to it, heart and soul. God had claimed Israel for his own people and promised to bless them if they obeyed. And Israel had declared that Jehovah was their God and that they would obey him. There was no doubt that God would keep his promises, but would Israel keep their promises? God had great things planned for Israel, just as he has great things planned for each of his children. References to Ephesians and 1 Corinthians. If the people kept their covenant promises to the Lord, he would bless them and make them a blessing. But if they disobeyed him, he would have to chasten them. But my people would not heed my voice, and Israel would have none of me. So I gave them over to their own stubborn hearts to walk in their own counsels. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries. He would have fed them also with the finest of wheat, and with honey from the rock I would have satisfied you. That's Psalms 81:11 to 14. God is faithful to us, but how much we miss when we're not faithful to him.
That's a good question. How much do we miss because
That's
we're not
it.
faithful?
So that breaks it down into 3 confessions, that chapter.
I find it interesting. I think that third year tithe kind of tells us how little their welfare system was. Because the third year tithe was for the one that was a stranger traveling, the fatherless, which would be the orphans, and the widow. Well, if they only had to take that tithe every 3 years and not sustained, we have so abused it in this country.
Yeah, there would be no way we could do every 3 years. And
No. Nope. Okay, 26, 1 through 3. Moses frequently called his hearers to remember what God had done for them and to do the things he required of them once they entered the promised land. One of the requirements was a bringing of the first of all the land's produce into the Lord at the central sanctuary. This offering of first fruits of their harvest was an opportunity for people to remind themselves and declare publicly that God had indeed given them the land as promised and that the produce was the proof. I think that's very interesting wording because and I think Corinthians says you're to bring your tithe joyfully. We went to African church in Philadelphia, and they dance. They bring their tithes forward and they dance coming up the aisle to give their offering to the Lord. And I love that he said it's an opportunity, because we think it's ours and we're being nice by giving God. It's already his. He's giving us the opportunity. Anyway, 4 through 11. After presenting their first fruits offering, the Lord would recite a saying in which they recounted their history and struggles from the days of Jacob to the day they stood before the Lord. Jacob, or Israel, was the wandering Armenian, which was a reference to his father Abraham's years in Aram on his way to Canaan. Jacob married Rachel, who was from the Armenian side of his family, and Jacob's family was small when he went down to Egypt under Joseph's protection. But the Israelites became a great and powerful and populous nation whom the Egyptians oppressed. And when the Israelites cried out to God, he delivered them and brought them to a land flowing with milk and honey. The first fruits ceremony gave each family the opportunity to bow down in gratitude to the Lord and rejoice, along with the Levites and the resident aliens who also were blessed by God's gracious hand. 12 through 15. There is a debate as to whether the tithe prescribed here to be brought in the third year was the regular third year tithe Moses had already taught about in Deuteronomy 14, a one-time offering like the first fruits offering above, or a second tithe to be made every third year. This was for the Levites, resident aliens, the fatherless, children, and the widows, those who had no other means of support. The worshiper was to declare that he was giving the whole tithe and not holding anything back. Based on this confession, he could pray for God's blessing on his people and land. At the conclusion to this lengthy message about Israel's covenant obligations to the Lord, Moses called for the people's complete commitment to the Lord and obedience to his statutes and ordinances as contained in his covenant. But their obedience was not to be grudging or mechanical. As people who were called to love the Lord their God with all their being, they were to obey him willingly, fully, heart and soul. I love that. Their obedience was not to be grudgingly or mechanical. People responded by affirming that the Lord was their God and that they would walk in his ways, keep his statutes and commands and ordinances, and obey him. God responded with his covenant promise that if his people would keep all his commands, he would elevate them to praise, fame, and glory above all the nations and make them a holy people to himself. Nothing else could compare. The end of 26. Any thoughts?
I found a map with Haran. Is it Aram or H-A? Haran.
Haran was where Abraham went.
There's both places. There's an Aram, A-R-A-M, and there's a Haran, however you say it.
Okay.
I made a note. How much do we miss because we are not faithful to him?
Oh, a lot.
I know, that really made me think. Like, I try, but like I do feel like I feel like we're very blessed in this country. We just take it for granted.
Yeah.
Most of us can go out to eat once a week. All
Well,
right. Did you have a thought, Kim?
nope. I'm good.
Okay. This concludes the read of God's word for today. We will pick back up tomorrow on chapter 27. We're moving right along. We're killing like a chapter a day. So tomorrow morning we'll pick up on Deuteronomy chapter 27.